So I've got a kind of a heady question that's coming out of this because you evoked a couple of things that I find interesting in terms of, what does this myth mean? And so you talked about the blood feuds, a couple of external processes, right, that this could be attached to. I'll ask the question and then I'll define kind of what I mean by it so that it kind of helps with your answer. But it's have you considered that the meaning may not be an external process, but rather a lesson for an internal process? And what I mean by that is, so if you look at, say, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, for example, he looks at world mythologies all over the place and finds a common thread, only to realize through his study of Jungian psychology that this is actually a roadmap. It's a roadmap to help us through the process of change, right? And so we all identify with the hero's journey on it's an archetypal story, meaning we all identify with it on a deep level because in one way or another, we are living it in our daily lives. Anytime there's a challenge we have to overcome, anytime we set out on a new kind of a growth pattern, right? And so I'm just wondering if Ragnarok really is, could it be, rather than attached to an external process, be attached to an internal process? So, for example, if I'm in a society and we know that teenagers are tumultuous and they can act rashly, their decision-making part of the brain is just not fully developed. And so you could almost see the old gods who are, a little bit loose sexually, a little bit violent, and then like the fratricide piece that you're talking about, if you commit this sin, then it will usher about the end of the world, but perhaps that just means the death and rebirth of the person internally, kind of like an ego kind of reset. It's basically like, what if it was more of a coming of age story to help young people become adults and go through that process of change where there is a metaphysical death and rebirth, versus the external. So I hope that made sense. But anyway, have you considered the internal process versus the external process as far as the meaning of the
Yeah, so there's a couple of things to say to that. One, I mean, you can always use stories to relate to as like an internal process, right? And that's what we do when we read. I think that's what most people find interesting about reading. I'm reading a fantasy novel about some dragon tamer on a different planet or something like that. But then this dragon tamer goes through, for instance, the transformation from child to teen to adult and so on, and that's relatable to me. We can always use stories like that. I will have to say that I'm not a fan of Joseph Campbell, nor am I a fan of Jung or the psychologized interpretation of mythology. Um, for a number of reasons. Campbell, to me, is problematic because this is a structuralist approach to mythology where we overlook quite often. That's what we do when we do structuralist interpretations. We overlook a lot of components in order to make them fit. A great example of that when it comes to Nordic mythology is Georges Dumézil, who created the tripartite theory of like the roles of the gods. Like Odin is like warrior priest, and Thor is like the warrior protector, and Freyr is fertility god, and so on. It's like, yeah, sure, cool. But what about all of those references in the material that hint at Freyr's role in war, right? So it's like already there, his structuralism breaks down. There might be some, useful, there are some useful aspects to structuralism in different ways, but it's usually quite reductive, right? So what it does is that it reduces reality to a scheme, to a Excel spreadsheet, and this is where I find it problematic to use that for mythology, right? Because mythology uh, and that's also a word that I don't like because that is it crams, what was once a living story world that was used by people for so many different things in their lives, right? Transit into a genre and category that's right next to fantasy in our modern ways of thinking about genres, right? Um, it's problematic to take mythology and reduce it that way because, as I just said, this these types of stories have been used by people for all kinds of things, right? And with that way of thinking, we also end up typically in placing the narratives and the information in the narratives on a hierarchical ladder between serious and unserious. So, for instance, great example, in Snorri Sturluson's Edda, he tells us that you have to cut your fingernails because if you die with long fingernails, then you're gonna end up adding to the ship of the dead, like Nalfar, that will bring all the demons at the end of Ragnarok and all that stuff, right? It's like, okay, so what are we gonna make of this? Well, if we're reading this from that perspective of like where does this end up in the hierarchy of seriousness, right? We're going to be like, okay, this is just like a tale for children, or this isn't serious and this isn't meaningful, and so on. But that's a very modern perspective on that type of literature, these type of stories, right? Because if you start taking this information seriously, then you also realize that Snorri Sturluson's stories, these stories about Thor fighting a giant somewhere, or the gods encountering an eagle somewhere, they have a bunch of really important information about how you actually survive in the North Atlantic environment. And that's an incredibly important detail that is overlooked if we treat mythology the way that we have usually treated mythology in the 19th and 20th century. And so when we've, for instance, psychologized the material and talk about it as like as something that can, uh, tell us about the transition between child, or from child to adult. Um, yes, it can be useful for that, but considering it the primary tool, that's where it gets problematic, if you ask me. Um, and another thing is too that if we think about Wörlersbau as a poem that could inform us on, the psychology of a teenager or something like that, you highlighted such things as promiscuity and moral shadiness, right? That's attached to the gods. Well, that might be our perspective, but we don't know if that was their perspective, right? Um, when we look at the poem as such, there are so many different processes that are happening and so many things that go into informing us about like the mind that created it, right? And the minds that have then reproduced it afterwards. Like keep in mind too that we're talking about several centuries of people adding to it, right? So we also have to like basically disband the idea of an author, right? And this is where some of my colleagues, for instance, would then be like, okay, well, that's too complex, so I'm just going to deal with the text that I have at hand and talk about that author, right? Or the authorship of 1270. It's like, okay, cool, you can do that. But that might not be the full story, first of all. And in my opinion, it might also not be that interesting because we want to know what those Vikings thought, right?
I really like it. It's everything you just said. First of all, I really enjoy because I am very much on the Campbell Jung bandwagon as a writer because I write historical fiction novels. That structure is very useful to me because it's what gives any story today mass market appeal, right? So it's
Yeah.
but then coming back and saying, okay, well, we have to remember that Campbell and Jung are trying to they're looking at how are these all the same versus
Hmm.
you're looking at how is it different? And it's a very different way of looking at it. And but then, as you mentioned, when you're looking at it as not oversimplifying it, there's so much more there. There's so much more substance, right?
Hmm.
That's really cool. I appreciate that answer because that's got the cogworks moving in my head where I'm like,
I'm glad to hear that. And yes, that's I think that's for me as a scholar and somebody who works with this material as something that could be useful in a broader way to restructure and rethink about who we are as human beings. Um, I feel like it's my duty essentially to look at the material in that way, right? um, and see where does it overlap with other story worlds, where does it not overlap, where there's something incredibly specific going on here, and we have those details in all kinds of tales from everywhere around the world, right? Um, and if you think about it in the broader sort of like social societal context, right? If we devalue these cultural stories that people have produced, either historically in a region in Europe or con in a contemporary setting among populations around the globe, right? We're also devaluating those human beings, right? We're ignoring aspects of their existence, right? If we just like say these are folk tales for children, or turn Scandinavian trolls into like these dumpy, humpy bumpy, silly creatures, right? When they're originally they were spirits that these people thought existed in trees and rocks and lakes and waters and so on, and that said something very important about how they related to the world, right? So, that's the direction I want to go in as somebody who's working with this on a scholarly level and also on a level that is trying to reactualize this material for the present. Because I think we talked to Terry a little bit about this last time. And like, we're in a situation nowadays, and where the way that we live, the way that we treat our world, has brought us to a point where we could be facing catastrophe, right? And so if we don't start thinking differently about our world, then we will probably be barreling towards that catastrophe, right? And that will be our Ragnarok.